Hello everyone, this is your friend and I am back with a new fanfic part 1. The fanfic title is What If Konan Died Then Reincarnated into a New World part 1. I hope you enjoy this fanfic, and if you enjoy this, so don't forget to subscribe my channel. Now let's start the fanfic. It happened slowly, or instantaneously. Pick one. It doesn't really matter, since time was not relevant until much further into this process. It began with the drifting together of particles, embling into a rough human shape. Eventually, thoughts returned. A sense of time developed. A short time later, it was complete, and Konan opened her eyes. She wondered, quite naturally, if this was heaven. But when she sat up and looked around at the dilapidated buildings surrounding her small rectangle of GR, it didn't look very heavenly. In front of her stood overgrown houses, their windows reduced to nothing but shards in the pane, if there was a pane, and surrounded by piles of spent nesting material from rodents and birds. She had never seen houses in such condition. Either they were war-blasted and destroyed, or still used for some purpose if not lived in. A building simply abandoned without any signs of a fight to explain why was not a familiar sight. It looked very sad, like something misused and empty. She turned and looked behind her, and had to simply stop and stare. The building behind her was similarly overgrown and abandoned, but it was a completely different kind of building. It had huge windows, a miv area of pavement with faint lines painted on in front of it, and many old signs with readable numbers and seemingly nothing else on them posted in front of it. It resembled faintly the shops of the Rain Village with their large windows and signs announcing special sales and deals, but shops were shops. This was something huge and sprawling and more than large enough to be lived in by several families. What could be big enough to require this much space in order to sell it? She glanced around with quick, hardly noticeable jerks of her head. No matter what it was, the sheer fact that she didn't know and couldn't guess was a bad sign. Being uninformed in possibly hostile territory is never a good thing to be. She tried to stand, and wobbled a bit with sudden disorientation. It felt as if she'd been lying there long enough for her legs to fall asleep and her heart to get used to inactivity. How long had she been lying there before waking up? That was unknowable. The blood came back to her head, and she stood up. She looked down and took stock of what she had. All of her clothing, intact and non-bloodstained, her ninja tool pack, the minor contents of her pockets. In short, everything she'd had upon death. That was good. She made some signs and paper briefly appeared and formed into wings. So she had her jutsu too. That was very good. There appeared to be no immediate danger, unless the diseases to be caught by urine-stained nesting material counted. The amount of broken GL made her very glad she wore such high boots, with decent soles. There was no telling who or what could be hiding among so many abandoned houses, but none of them had signs of battle and most had been very recently occupied by the sorts of animals that were the first to flee at human activity. In contrast to the openness and complete lack of defense provided by the large storefront, a maze of abandoned houses seemed much safer. She looked up at the pale blue sky with wisps of clouds floating in it. It looked almost mystical in how ordinary it was, how completely lifeless and uninspired. Rain clouds did not look much drearier. If this was heaven, it was at least as derelict as the buildings. She expected this wasn't heaven. If that was the case, how could she possibly have gotten here after death? She paused in the middle of the road and looked up and down its entire length. There were trees to the north, and none to the south. It seemed to be all stores in that direction. She continued crossing to the east and considered moving a couple degrees to the south as she scouted. If there were people nearby, it would not do to be surprised by them. For now, it was mid-afternoon. She jumped onto the roof of a house and noted that there were a lot of them. She could spend the night in any one of them. The next few hours passed quickly as she searched through the houses for any useful materials. None of them had food, but she did find a few that still dispensed water through their faucets. The smell and cloudiness made this discovery less than useful. Some may have been abandoned in a hurry. There were still sheets in the bedrooms. There was no reason to take them for now, but why on earth would they still be there? She filed that away as a mystery to potentially look into. Night fell, and as the lights from a vague southeasterly direction became and remained visible, she realized that there were people in that direction, and They did not go to sleep at a reasonable time. Her stomach growled, and she swooped down from the rooftops to head north. She had determined what resources there were in the abandoned houses and on herself. She had located the nearest people and decided they would be best scouted out in the daytime. The most pressing need right now was food, and the forest was the most likely source of that. It was all organized very logically, if a little bent from careful avoidance of the important questions. Alone, in an unknown place, and very likely an unknown world, without allies or familiar structures, what was she going to do? She very deliberately stepped on broken gland, ground her nails into her palms. Take care of the need for food now. Panic and search for her friends later. There was nothing else she knew how to do in this place. She reached the edge of the forest in about 15 minutes running. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to call it a woodland. This could not properly be called a forest. Most of the branches were not thick enough to comfortably stand on, and the highest ones that were stable enough to stand on were plainly visible from the ground, even with freshly growing leaves on them. Not one of the trees growing here could be more than 3 years old. Nonetheless, the fresh green growth should have attracted some manner of beast. She stepped quietly between piles of dry leaves on the ground, ears alert for anything moving. The howls of a pack of wolves were difficult to pinpoint, but not that far away, perhaps 1 kilometer. She made sure to move roughly parallel to them, hoping they would frighten something in her direction. A small furry thing crossed her vision a few trees away. She stepped mostly on patches of bare ground as she approached, kunai in hand. Aside from the kunai, everything about this hunt came easily, down to the ducking under branches of stunted trees. The woods just on the edge of the rain village had been a little like this, but that was a long time ago. She pounced on the fat, waddling rodent and put the blade through its skull. It squished a little, like poorly ripened melon. She shook her head. What about a foreign world where destiny had not gone as planned could inspire thoughts of the past? Especially those parts of the past that were so unhelpful to any situation she had ever encountered. She gritted her teeth and tore at the beast's skin with more force than necessary, not noticing. Those parts of the past must not be brought up. They only led to pain. After she was done thoroughly repressing the unpleasantness of the past, she finished skinning the rodent and made sure to wear her best flat face while cutting its flesh into strips. The wolves howled slightly less than a kilometer away. The presence of wolves in the middle of a forest and the lack of people in the surrounding area convinced her that it might be a good idea to build a fire. Both facts would normally indicate a lack of potential enemies, so it seemed safe to do so. She didn't know any fire-style jutsus, but the edge of a kunai and an appropriate rock worked just as well. Stick to the details. It's safer that way. It was hard to help, though, considering how she had died. She sat and stared into the flames as she considered the last few seconds of her former life. She'd failed. Nagato's body had most likely been desecrated within minutes, his valuable eyes stolen. What did Tobi, Madara intend to do with that power? The Uchiha clan seemed to have a talent for implanting eyes. It was likely he had simply stolen Nagato's power for himself. Even now he was probably marching on a wave of conquest, subverting the hopes of her comrades and herself, throwing the waves of destiny aside. She closed her eyes. She'd promised to uphold their dreams after Nagato's death. She'd promised to herself, to Naruto, to them in her heart, and even to Tobi that she would hold up their bridge to peace. Could Naruto go on to stop the path of war and point the way to peace? It would be best if he could, but she couldn't simply place all her hopes on him. Pinning all her hope on another was, in part, the reason why the darkness had appeared and seized her so quickly after Yahiko died. There were other reasons too, but not so easily preventable. The past would stay the past. No matter the future, she'd failed. She opened her eyes and looked into the darkness. How many terrible things hid there? She could be fairly certain that she did not know them all. The thoughtless, reckless Konan she had met and even now feared was surely not the only form of darkness. She squinted into the gloom. It almost seemed to swim before her eyes, as slick as it always was, taking on the forms of innumerable mares every second. One of them darted suddenly, and she remembered the laughter from back then. Her heart skipped a beat in fear. Anything might be possible in this abandoned, half-broken world. Could the contents of her heart have become real? Help me, Hidan. She remembered to breathe just in time, as the wolves howled again, much further away. Then her chest froze again as an answering howl sounded, much closer to her. She looked down at the strips of meat over the fire, which looked done, and took them all away from the heat. It must have been the smell that lured this one here. She gripped her kunai at her side and stood up, cursing herself as she did so for being an idiot. Here she had sat, gripped in fear of the darkness itself, forgetting that it was the things inside the darkness that posed a tangible threat. Her eyes scanned the darkness, faster after she seemed to hear a distant sound. It was definitely a footstep, but somehow sounded too large to be a wolf's. She would have laughed if she didn't have years of practice wearing her flat face, but then remembered being convinced that her evil twin somehow had Umed separate form in the night. It would be hypocritical to laugh at herself for thinking of werewolves. Or would it only be hypocritical if she laughed at someone else for that? Her eyes narrowed at a distant shadow, visible only by a faint gleam that did not seem to be from moonlight. She waited as it moved closer. It was definitely human. Had someone snuck closer under the cover of the wolves? In that case, where was the wolf she had heard coming closer? Another mystery. She waited as the shadow approached. Judging from the shape she could see, it appeared to be that of a grown man. The gleam was coming from his hair. Was white hair common in this world? Or could it be an enemy of hers? She mentally facepalmed at not having realized that there was no proof she was the only ninja trapped in this world. Well, if this was another shinobi, the one thing she could count on was some sort of discussion before anything, battle or otherwise, commenced. He seemed to be alone. This was a very good opportunity for information. And, if he was friendly, she could thank him for breaking her out of her thoughts. As he approached the fire, close enough to make out some of his features, and ducked under a tree, she held the kunai out in a more visible position where it gleamed. He came out from under the branch, turned to face her, and immediately jumped back with a quick, ah. Then he turned slightly red and stammered to apologize. Oh, geez, sorry. Didn't mean to scare you. Sigh, I'm an idiot. It's the middle of the woods at night. There's no such thing as not scared. But anyway, I didn't come here to alt you or anything, I just smelled the meat and thought it smelled good, and wanted to know if you would share. Quote, it took all of the years of practice she had at keeping a perfectly steady face not to let her mouth fall open while he was speaking. Firstly, he was dressed in a hooded sweater of a design she hadn't seen before, and otherwise perfectly normal pants made of a material that she hadn't seen before either. The way he dressed seemed entirely foreign in some way she couldn't pinpoint exactly. Secondly, the way he talked was very strange, maybe as if he were the world's most shy child. But even children didn't exactly talk like that. Thirdly, she actually did recognize him. The gleam was from his long white hair, tied back in a rough ponytail. His facial features were almost uncannily similar. It was hidden well, but he had a short blade at his side. There was no doubt about it. According to everything she'd heard or seen, this was Hatake Sakumo. His tendency to willingly offer up insults against himself, though, almost had her laughing. She felt the urge to pinch herself just to make sure she wasn't having some fantasy dream. Here was a well-known shinobi, probably in possession of substantial knowledge, and he appeared to be willing to say 5 times more information than she desired without her even having to ask. She put the kunai away and smiled as she offered him one of the skewers, hoping that his status as a gold min didn't show too much on her face. Oh, thank you, he said, and looked for a place to sit down. He found one and proceeded to tear the meat off its stick eagerly. Tonight's catch didn't go so well, and I can't really stay out much later than this anyway. It's good to go to sleep with a full belly. I hope everyone else finds something, though. We're getting new pups soon. They'll need it. Pups? She inquired, raising her eyebrows. Yep. It's spring, getting close to the start of denning season. You probably heard them, the pack. They're so excited. That's because the alpha female is already looking for a den site. Fingers crossed that all the pups will live this year. He ripped off the rest of the strip, swallowed it almost whole, and hesitantly gestured for another piece, which she was too happy to give him. Konan took another bite herself and waited purposefully another few seconds before asking, "So, you know that pack?" "How?" Tsukumo finished chewing another overly large piece of meat. "He must have been very hungry. I've known them since childhood. They're my family. My cousins, mostly." The obvious response to that was on her lips before she suppressed it at the last moment. No way, that was a silly idea. She wasn't 3 and scared of the dark. Not that she could remember ever having been scared of the dark, until just a few minutes ago. This same foolish idea had occurred to her a few minutes ago, too. Maybe it would be good to engage in his terms for now. "Are you a werewolf?" He smiled as if sharing a joke and stated in a mocking way, "Nah, just a half-wolf, sorry." She silently stared at him and blinked slowly for an overly long stretch of time, until he realized he wasn't fooling anyone. "That's, exactly what it sounds like. I'm partly wolf. My mother was one. I promise, it's not exactly as perverted or anything as it sounds. I'm perfectly normal anyway. Just a normal guy, who happens to have a wolf family." His face was all flushed, and he couldn't seem to meet her eyes. "That is not any less weird than a werewolf, I know. I know. I don't know why I'm saying this much to be honest. Can I perhaps blame it on you being very charming?" Quote. His obvious emberment and slight fear went straight past her defenses and woke up the laughing, reckless part of her that was on alert for such things, so she reached over without thinking and stroked his hair, like with a pet dog. He froze, but began to relax. "Nah, blame it on the moonlight. It's the same as admitting you're a lunatic, but nobody notices." She smiled and ran the edge of her boot along his leg, then pushed his head away dismissively. She forced the last of the skewers into his hands as she asked, "You must have other half-beast buddies of yours, right? I'm sure they're fascinating. Anything else special about your people?" Well, yeah, fascinating. We're really strong." A blush of a different nature remained on his face now. She bared her teeth and thought triumphantly, "If I cut his face open right now it'd shoot geysers." "Cut. No breaking things yet. I need to find more." He squeezed his eyes shut and regained composure. "I mean, yeah, we're really strong. I have no idea how. I don't remember going through special training or anything, but I can punch through a tree somehow. Durable too. I mean, we're durable too, because my fist doesn't break from doing that. We've kind of formed a group in the forest to the east, and there are half snakes and bears and tigers and other beasts." That was like a year and a half ago. Suddenly he tensed and straightened. The blush disappeared, and a confused look came over his face. He suddenly looked very much like a man with something to say. She eagerly waved her foot back and forth and had to restrain a purr as he stopped and looked her dead in the eyes. "That's when the first of us started to get together, I mean. A year and a half ago. It just didn't make any sense to them anymore. I joined only a few months ago, because that's when it stopped making sense to me. Before that it made perfect sense, like of course people can have totally different species for parents, that's not strange at all, happens all the time. I just could not notice that was weird, as if something was keeping me from seeing it. I didn't even think about it. Nobody did. It was unreal." He stopped to catch his breath, and her foot resumed waving back and forth. That wasn't all. He was on the edge of something. Just a little push. She leaned forward slightly, careful to narrow her two wide eyes so not to scare him, and breathe. Head. So. His eyes met hers again, and the look of someone who's just woken up came across his face. His voice was very quiet as he asked the one question that, honestly, it was strange he hadn't asked at the start. "Who are you?" "Yes. Finally. Wolf boy here's found some brains." She smiled sweetly in the way she had as a little girl and flippantly replied, "Konan. I'm real, and if you help me I can find myself a much better idea of what's happened than you can. I just need to know one thing. So you, the one who is strange, know that something's off." "Awesome. Does anyone else? I mean all the shopkeepers, the pedestrians, the people who aren't strange that live around you. Would they give me a second glance as I walked around in this costume?" Tsukumo blinked, and his entire body language became more confident now that she was forthright. She considered that if he was telling the truth, then he was not consciously aware of what he was or what he could do. He'd probably unconsciously detected that she had a hidden motive and had been off kilter this whole time. He straightened and said, "No. That was what I meant earlier, when I said, nobody did. I didn't find anything unusual before, and neither did anyone else, even though I obviously didn't hide a NY thing. And everybody in town has kept on treating me as if nothing's wrong since I woke up. I can't be sure if that applies to you, though. Do you have a before? It might be different for you if you don't." Quote. Crazy. Reckless Konan was beginning to edge back into her box, but she had one last note of caution to completely ignore before she did. What are the odds of that? If they did recognize me as strange, and I demonstrated some of the things you've mentioned, either they would be forced to both of us, be forced to recognize both of us, or develop a reality-breaking case of cognitive dissonance. I like my odds. She stood up and reached out a hand. He took it and stood up, and she hastily said, while reason reared it itself, before emberment and uncertainty returned, "Thank you for telling me where to find you, and for your help. I suppose it's only fair to tell you whatever theories I come up with." He shook her hand with a rueful grin and replied, "Just promise me you'll give me some warning before you milk me like a factory cow next time. Unless it's necessary. Did you say something about not staying up too late?" His smile dropped almost as fast as his hand did, into his pockets from which he quickly pulled out a small rectangle. He touched it, and it started to glow. He turned it off and stuffed it back into his pockets, mumbling, "Yes, I did. Thank you. I've got things to do tomorrow and I need sleep, so glad you reminded me." "Thank you." He held up a hand in farewell and said, "Good luck on your mystery solving," as he left. Then he disappeared into the darkness, and the forest was quiet again. Only then did Konan notice the fire was barely more than embers. She looked around and closed her eyes, muttering a prayer of thanks to any god that might be listening, including Hedon's, if he really was paying attention to her. That this world had lower standards of acceptable behavior in a conversation. She thought of running her boot along Sakumo's leg and felt slightly nauseous. At least she'd kept her priorities in line this time. That thought consoled her somewhat as she kicked dirt over the embers until they were completely smothered. Alone in the dark, she looked up at the moon and its own softly shimmering embers. "Good moves there. You're crafty. I particularly like the whole, slightly crazed, wondering if you should kill him now, part. You sure look interesting. Let's play sometime," said a voice right behind her, just over her right shoulder. She of course spun around as soon as it started speaking, but there was nothing there as the voice finished its compliment. A giggle came down from high in the treetops where no human's weight could be supported, followed by a whooshing sound much further away. Then she was alone. Again. What the hell was that? She looked all around her, knowing it was useless. Her pounding heart commanded her to check anyway. She sent up a silent prayer of thanks again for Sakumo and his wonderful information. Clearly not much of what she knew was applicable to whatever place this was. She could only thank random gods that that situation would soon be remedied. As she turned and ran faster than was necessary back to her nest for the night, she pieced together in her mind the good news she had gotten so far. I was right. Other shinobi who have died are somehow coming back to life in this world. But, according to him, all the others have memories of always having lived here. Why are mine intact? Lucky for me, those false memories can be easily distinguished. The time estimate he gave suggests that this phenomenon began a year and a half ago, at least, if I take the moment their existence became real, as the moment they actually came back to life here. She promptly tripped over a branch in her way and had to put out her hands to catch herself. Her heart skipped several beats as she lay frozen there, in the dark. A year and a half, my gods, that's perfect. That covers everyone's deaths. Sasori's was only 8 months ago. If they're here, then I'm not alone. I can have the Akatsuki behind me. She smiled as she got up and started running again. Even Nagato, not Yahiko, though, and since I haven't given up my memories and become part of this world, would they know me? Doubtful. I don't have a before. On she ran, to wait out the longest night of her lives. Something rustled in her room. That was what woke Konan up and set her heart beating like a decent competitor to a hummingbird's. The image of wavering darkness and the sound of whooshing remained in her eyes and ears for at least 2 seconds after she opened her eyes, sat up, and looked around all in one move. It was, of course, a pigeon. She stared at the bird, and it stared back. Eventually she moved her hand and it leisurely flew out a broken window. The sun was shining down through that window upon the floor in a large square. How long had it been up? She kept her mouth shut, but uttered a curse or two in her thoughts as she packed up all her things, tucked them into her ninja pack, carefully hid her ninja pack so it wasn't very obvious and wouldn't frighten them off, and went up on the roof. It was going to take a lot of traveling today to arrange this. If all Akatsuki members were here, they would probably have the same amnesia Tsukumo's group had. That meant she would have to somehow convince them that they had once been a group called the Akatsuki, that they could be again, and what exactly that meant. Tsukumo had said that he found his strength and physical durability strange. If being able to not break bones on a single tree was strange, how would she convince any of them that they had what she had to admit sounded a lot like magical powers? What are my intentions? To summarize, they are 1. To gather the Akatsuki in a group again, 2. To inform them that they are not people of this world, but actually come from another, and 3. Enlist their help in figuring out how to get their memories back and find out what is happening. She folded her hands in front of her and narrowed her eyes in concentration. To do that, I will need to actually gather them together in one space, tell all of them at once what I need them to know, and hope they'll believe it. She dug her nails into her forehead. That is the plan of a complete idiot. Just randomly hope they'll believe me, a strange lady who probably looks foreign to them just like Tsukumo looked foreign to me. After I tell them they can do magic. Well, I have my own jutsu, but if they're like Tsukumo was that might confuse them more than it would convince them of anything. I'll need an ally, someone more convincing to them. But of course, they're the only allies I have. Well, there's a possibility some of them might be easier to convince than others. Who among them is the least likely to be skeptical, the most likely to believe his own eyes over his ideas of what should be possible, the least invested in whatever so RT of life he may already have? She had to laugh. The answer to that was obvious. I have found Hidan's ideal world, haven't I? Ah, but then there was the matter of finding a space to gather them in. Couldn't be too public, or self-consciousness and emberment would injure her efforts. How would she get them to go there? That would require convincing them she had something worthwhile to say while not mentioning what it was, a tricky idea. It all comes down to trust, and they have no reason to trust me. And there was the even trickier matter of finding them all. As an organization, they did not get along very well. The odds they can all be found close to each other are just about nil. And what if they do get along? They might have come to the same realization Tsukumo's group has, banded together in some form already, possibly with others. That could make it even harder for me, as they would have an established order backing someone else. That was the moment she realized she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do. The stage was set for a MIV self-confidence crisis. Don't panic. Think. You've been part of the Akatsuki's founding before. How did it happen? Well, I already was a member of a group, set up by someone else, Jiraiya-sensei. We acted as a group, protecting innocence, not seeking very much to attract new members. New members just came to us, attracted by Yahiko's boundless hope and his terrible speeches. We never asked membership of anyone. Yahiko just had the gift. He had Jiraiya-sensei's hope and he had the look in his eyes to share it. He could share that hope, and Nagato had the power that could believably make that hope possible. What did I have? I looked nice. That one man who joined early on wanted to be with me. I had bandages. I motivated Yahiko and Nagato, pushed them to move forward because I needed to be protected. Even that. I failed at. It was my fault Yahiko died. When he died, the rest of us forgot what it was we hoped for. Nagato didn't have that hope in himself. Our path fell into darkness. We were the enemy. Naruto had Jiraiya-sensei's hope like Yahiko did, and we were his enemy. That wouldn't have happened, if I hadn't been captured. Why did he give himself up to save me? Recruit a medical ninja. Lean on each other. I wasn't needed, but he was essential. Did he think we could live without him? That'd be just like Yahiko, he was amazing. Nagato was strong. What am I? What am I? What am I, without them? Her tears fell silently, darkening one of the red clouds on her cloak and dripping into her boot. Where is my hope? Do I believe the world can be redeemed? Can I be redeemed? She thought of a long time ago, sneaking through the small woods on the edge of the rain village for small creatures. She knew it was wrong, but the blood beating through her body, through her heart and all the way down to her guts, hummed with an energy that commanded her forward. A small mouse, gathering seeds for her babies too young to live without her. Repeated prodding with a needle revealed one spot on the back which elicited more squealing, more twisting and writhing from pain, than any other. Her heartbeat and breathing conspired against her. At the age of 6, she set down this mother mouse and watched until it thrashed so violently it broke its back and its flailing claws happened to catch the side of its neck. Had that feeling been fear? Fear isn't generally located in the crotch. I was sorry, but not sorry enough to stop. What good is feeling sorry then? The answer is no. I never believed it could ever go away. This poisonous beat that throbs beneath my skin, through my nerves, it is a beat of darkness, squeezing ever tighter, and it will not let go. I don't have the strength to throw it off. It will squeeze me dry, dirty me, break every limit I have. And then it will turn on those I hold nearest to my heart. Did I help Nagato lose his way? I sure as hell didn't stop it. That beat which is the will that pushes me forward, a will stronger than all the words I have taken into my conscience from those I learned from, it did not have the inclination to listen to Yahiko's words. My will of pain. She opened her eyes and cupped her hand beneath her face. Soon, it was full of pearls. One of them caught the sunlight and sparkled. She tilted her hand to shade it. Still, that one drop sparkled, even as the others darkened. It dripped from the edge of her thumb, and became a little red sparkle on her cloak. So she crushed it with her palm. That spot of red still seemed brighter in the sunlight. It was determined to be eternal. Suddenly, she recalled something she had once heard about eternity. It was as they were sealing one of the tailed beasts. Hidan was very annoyed that he and Kakuzu hadn't been the ones to capture it. When were they going to get a Jinchuriki to fight? Why did it have to be money 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 all the time? Kakuzu pointed out that his sacrifice ritual was good for killing, not capturing, and bounties were useful dead while Jinchurikis weren't, but it didn't even slow him down. When would he get to make the decisions for once about what missions to agree to, and on and on. Nagato, as Pain finally had enough and snapped that the organization needed money to achieve its goals, that its goals were the purpose of his membership in the first place. Hidan had not agreed with that statement. The would you know about purpose? He'd asked. What are our goals, again? Oh, that's right, power. Last I heard, power was good for two things: getting what you want, and keeping it. The point of power is to make yourself happy. If you're not happy, your life is nothing but stinking trash swirling down someone else's gutter. If you're not happy, and you have no plans to be, that's what the real death penalty is. All these people I hear, saying shit like, let's change the world. Let's help others. Let's collect a shit ton of money for no good reason. Only the fact that they had to stand still for the sealing ritual restrained Kakuzu from leaping at him at that point. They're justing around. By the time they realize the only point of life is to have fun with it, they're screwed. People who want to walk a path lined with unicorns and candy canes are always unhappy. They get a few good times, and then they're back to screwing themselves over for things that are impossible anyway. I hate that word, sorry. I've never been sorry. I'll never be sorry. Sorry means that you have no sense, because anyone with a sense of basic math can see that one moment is not equal to a billion other moments. 1 hour of SN ain't equal to the years idiots spend feeling guilty and sad for it. If your life is forever ruined by one thing, then just kill yourself. If you don't want to kill yourself, don't be sorry. I don't plan to spend the rest of my immortality swatting myself upside the head for everything other people say I've done. Go yourself if you want to make me. My purpose here is to further my own happiness, no more. You can go shove your tiny purpose up the of the real purpose. I'll be here smiling. Konan smiled at that memory. She had never heard Hidan be coherent when he was mad, and she never did again. Most of the time he just picked up his weapon and charged. And even then, it wasn't that coherent. It was just enough for her to hear what he meant, and that was what mattered. Screwing themselves over for things that are impossible anyway, was that what she was doing? Punishing herself for something she couldn't remember ever having been without, and couldn't remove. Was that unfair? She shut her eyes and ran through his entire rant again, and let out a small gasp of surprise when she realized that word wasn't actually in there. It was what he'd been talking about, of course. Eternal punishment for a single moment was not fair. But, weren't there some things that were simply unforgivable? She recalled Nagato at the end, realizing what he'd become, not wishing for redemption. But he had died right after. The real death penalty. His death had made it more noble, in a way. If Nagato had kept living, always sorry, it might have been something like a different, much sadder death. What did her will have the inclination towards? Why, that was what all wills have an inclination towards. I want to live. She clenched her fist. I want to live. Yahiko's last words were to take care of me. I can't rely on Nagato or anyone else to do that for me forever, and if I let myself be condemned forever, that'll be one last failure. Perhaps there are other things that are unforgivable, but that would be the most unforgivable of them all. For him more than anybody else, I ought to live. If that's wrong, I'll remember. But it would be worse to be sorry. She looked up and surveyed the landscape, the tears drying on her face. There's one thing I have. It's never been in agreement with me, so I usually don't count it, but nonetheless it's there. For better or for worse, there is this impenetrable will inside me, which nobody can stop or turn. She clutched her stomach. I can make the Akatsuki again. I will make it again. I know, because I can feel it. This is what I am. I am in alignment with myself. Having settled that, Konan decided that, until she got everyone together and could hope for Hidan's support, but of course who knows how helpful he'll be, if they know him enough to trust him. They probably know he's slightly nuts, and even if she didn't get said support, she still wouldn't be alone. She would be her own ally. That's a riskier gamble than betting on Hidan. At least he's sane. A very desperate gamble. But, I am desperate. So, she turned inward and asked herself what to do with all this uncertainty. Wing it. It'll be fine, whatever happens. What are you worrying so much about? Ah, yes, the old, who cares, line of reasoning. So, stick to the plan she'd originally come up with. If things didn't work out, find another direction to pursue, all would be well. I'm starting to sound less than completely there myself. But I promised. Step 1. Find a place to gather them all together for her pitch. An abandoned house would make a terrible place for them to believe her. The site should be somewhere not so remote, larger, better maintained than these glorified rat nests, yet not somewhere they would feel the influence of societal expectations of reason. In other words, a larger building closer to the town that was also abandoned but not for as long. A feeling of warmth seemed to unfold in her chest at these thoughts. Each glowing petal of it unfolded out to its full length, then continued. Further it grew, pouring through her muscles. She looked down to see she was not, in fact, floating. Yet the new strength convinced her she could. I don't have anybody, but I'm doing this anyway, and I think it's going to work. If this is what not being entirely there results in, I want more. The warm blaze sent her eyes in a southeasterly direction. Time to begin. She got to her feet, wiped away any tear tracks that might still be on her face, and flew from roof to roof in that direction. Not literally, that would have been a waste of chakra, but metaphorically. Time seemed to stand still until she saw the abandoned houses thin out into empty roadside. The road was heading straight east, and she judged her position to be far enough south that she should be able to enter the town from the west if she continued on this path. She glanced for a brief moment at the road itself, though, because it was a very strange one. It had colored lines running along its length, yellow in the center and white on each edge. It was smooth black rock as well, not a dirt path, but that made sense because a dirt path could not be painted on. The direction of causality might flow in the other direction. It had been paved first, then someone realized that made it good for painting, but that was highly unlikely. Paved roads in the city made sense, but this was not in a city. Why would anyone go to such expense to pave a traveling path? As far as she knew, traveling paths between settlements were mostly used by people on foot and the occasional carriage. Wait a sec. She looked at the lines again. The space between them appeared to be perhaps half a meter more than the width of a carriage, and there were two such spaces. Is it meant for carriages traveling to and from the town? Looking at the white lines marking the edge of the road, an image appeared in her head of similar lines, painted on pavement as faded and cracked as they were in front of a giant storefront. Was that a store for carriages? How wealthy is this world? It made sense they would have dedicated paths then, but why with lines on them, and why paved? Wheels did need a smoother surface than feet, but not this smooth, and the edges of the road were clearly marked with GR. Maybe if they were moving very fast, small obstacles would disrupt them more and it would be harder to see. Her legs moved before that thought was completely finished, propelling her away from the road and onto the GR. How fast would that have to be? Fast enough it may be difficult to sense them coming. It's not safe to be a walking traveler here. Fast-moving carriages owned by enough people that there are entire stores to sell them in. What is this world? Why didn't I ask Tsukumo about any of this? What could be used to accelerate such large, unwieldy things to such speeds? Is there similar acceleration in common use for weapons? Hope to God that most people are peaceable. This entire train of thought had taken about a minute and a half to run through, and as Konan waited for her heart to slow, she concentrated until she could feel hope and warmth run through her body. Again, just a shadow of before, but still there. Even so, chills ran up and down her spine. Here was her first true, concrete proof that this world was only marginally like her own. Tsukumo's assurances that she might not stand out seemed absurd. And if her friends had integrated into this world like Tsukumo, how different would they be? They may not really be the Akatsuki anymore. If I'm lucky, they might still be a shadow of themselves, like this world is a shadow of mine. But so different. A rushing sound like nothing she'd ever heard before filled her ears. It sounded similar to wind rushing along a desolate, rocky valley floor, but not quite. It was too purposeful and directed. It sounded like something approaching at high speed. She got to her feet, prepared for evasive maneuvers, but then something appeared over the nearest hill on the road and rushed past on entirely separate business. She didn't bother holding her jaw closed as it grew smaller and disappeared. If that was a carriage, she was a macaque. Perhaps a distant cousin, but certainly no near relation. It was larger, it was metal, it was shining, its wheels were small yet powerful looking and sturdy. An unusual feeling came over her at the sight of this. It felt like respect, only larger. In contrast to the 5 minutes or less it had taken to reach the houses, Konan figured she had to have been running for at least 10 minutes by the time the shape of a large building came into distant view. But of course, as a trained ninja, 10 minutes of running barely counted as a warm-up, so she eagerly picked up the pace upon seeing it. When she reached the building, she reflexively suppressed a smile, although there seemed to be no reason to do so. It was large, check. Through its doors, she could see a large room where one would welcome guests, check. It was clearly abandoned, check. But it was still in good condition, with even its pale outsides not much tarnished, check. She examined the large paved area in front of it. The white lines were more obvious, since it hadn't been left for as long as the large store, but the pavement was in an unpleasant condition and everything was quite exposed. Konan, as a ninja, did not like the last one, but of course she realized that may not matter to the others. It didn't matter anyway, because she was standing near a part of the GR surrounding the building which was flat and almost even to the road. There was no reason those things couldn't move over such flattened GR, and she investigated the side of the building to determine that yes, there was a path leading to a flat area of dirt next to the building. The entire back and some of the sides were surrounded by the forest which was pressed up against this building, so that area was decently hidden. Just to make triply sure, she raced to the front and opened the door, stepped inside. The welcoming area seemed uncomfortable in some way she couldn't identify. It may have had to do with the crack in one wall, so she moved into the rest of it. The ground floor had several large rooms, but only one caught her attention as she peered. As with the welcoming room, she couldn't be sure why. It had a long counter to her left with shelves above, and the right had some short cabinets. In between, the floor was tiled with some sort of decorative pattern in white. The lights on the ceiling were not extremely harsh, but seemed to have dulled over its time. She retroactively realized that the building also had electricity. There was another entryway on the other side from where she entered, and that one did not have a door. The entry she stood in did have a door, but it was propped open. Perhaps that was why it felt comfortable. This room was not an easy trap, nor too exposed. At last, she was sure. If there was any reason someone would want to convince me there was a God, they just succeeded. I have no idea why, but something inside tells me this is not too good to be true. It's just too good to be coincidental. It could be luck, but a flicker of a thought went through her mind. It asked, "Why are you believing in these things?" The flicker tried to conjure up fear at her sudden inability to stick to reason, at the idea that there could be something influencing her, etc. That was its downfall. Said flicker was almost instantly crushed by the signal of faith that was telling her these things, and as a result Konan would never realize her inner transformation until it was too late. The groundwork had been laid over the past few years, this was merely the catalyst. She left the room and continued searching, this time for a writing implement. Eventually she found her way to a room that had a desk in it, and as she looked through its drawers she found a strange blue tube-shaped thing with a tapered point. It looked similar to some writing implements of her world, but of an odd design. She created a single sheet of paper with her jutsu and tried it, finding that it did dispense ink somehow. Remembering some numbers she had seen on a post near the front entrance and a faded sign that seemed to mark the road it was on, she returned outside and wrote them down. She had directions to give to her companions, presumably they would have those vehicles to get here. There was a decent-sized room to speak to them in. Konan decided to stop thinking about how perfectly everything was lining up for her to get the Akatsuki back together. It was taking too much time. She turned and retraced her steps, making her way back to the original fork in the road by midday. Once there, Konan paused for a moment to consider her next moves. There were some considerations to be made before just blindly charging in. She looked both ways, crossed the road, and settled in a hollow under a tree on the opposite side. The shade was pleasant and helped to cool off her cloak, which had soaked up the sun and was now radiating heat onto her, but she did not start to relax. She looked up into the blue spots peeking through the leaves above, and considered her approach. Perhaps they wouldn't be as wary as she had been when she was approached by a stranger, but expecting them to be comfortable would be like expecting them to be retarded. She would have to come up with something to say in a way of holding herself that would put them at ease, make them more receptive to her proposal. She knitted her fingers together and rested her head on her knuckles, pondering. A few lines she thought of and considered, but ultimately discarded, and Konan had no idea what ped for harmless and not up to any trickery in this world. She did narrow down her list of details to include to the bare essentials. Any more would be too outlandish, but aside from that she concluded that speaking and acting natural, not scripted, was likely to work the best. The next consideration was how to find them. That was a complete unknown, since she had no idea where any of them were. She figured that the best she could do there was some variation of hoping she got lucky again and was able to reach all of them. But how to get them all in that building together to hear her? Should she ask them to come at a specific time? No, that's demanding a little too much, to ask them to make plans just because I want them to. It may be easier for them to be spontaneous, to decide to listen to me on a whim rather than on a decision. Decisions take reason, and there is no reason to listen to someone who really doesn't belong here. This train of thought suddenly reached a switching point, and a possibility occurred to her that she really should have thought of earlier. Why am I here? It felt at first like waking up from deep unconsciousness, which is to say, perfectly natural. But being reanimated in another world is not perfectly natural. Is there any chance I was brought here for a reason? That would certainly explain her unrealized growing conviction that she was not alone, not unseen, perhaps not unpossessed. I do feel somewhat like a puppet. But I did agree to this, even if it was under distress, and it feels good. I suppose if someone has done something to me, and I am here for a specific reason, I forfeited my right to complain a long time ago. The spots of deep azure appeared to dance before her, even though she knew it had to be the green sprouting leaves that were moving. Konan blinked, and the illusion disappeared. Why is today so much more beautiful than yesterday? She shook her head, stood up, and turned, ready to walk into town. How can I have lived my whole life in a state of uncertainty, never knowing, having to make my own answers, and yet not encounter such sprouting fields of questions before today? Maybe it was a consequence of being alone. That thought induced her to start running into town. Sprouting fields of questions were not fully good things, and she was starting to get tired of them. Once the sparse trees gave way to functional buildings, with other people in and around them and ever. Why thing? Konan found herself doing something she had never even contemplated doing, wonder gazing. Similar to tourist gazing, only she was genuinely interested in learning about what she was looking at. Of course, for the first few streets she remembered that her plan hinged, at least partially, on Oing unnoticed, and so she made an effort to walk as if she belonged there and all was normal while discreetly observing the civilians she ped. A young woman peered at her closely as she ped, and Konan quickly found a post behind a corner to watch this woman from, but upon doing so she saw the young lady peering in a small mirror at her own makeup and looking dissatisfied. So, someone of this world had been looking closely at her appearance, which was the only thing that stood out to the casual eye, and saw nothing except a reason to be jealous. Konan considered the matter and came to the conclusion that someone primarily interested in appearance should be the first to notice of anyone, so she took that as a sign that she would go unnoticed as hoped. Not of course that there had been serious doubt of that. Once that was resolved, she had her attention available to focus on other things. And that's how a good few hours disappeared from the day, torn out of the normal 24-hour cycle by some mysterious portal because it was impossible that she, as Hinobi well practiced at paying attention to her surroundings, could have possibly spent that long looking at, how many things. It was hard to remember. So instead she attempted to count the things she had learned, after finding a place underneath a tree in the park close to the center of town. Konan adopted her thinking posture, with her head on her knuckles again, and tried to summarize. She'd learned the relative location of the park, for one. So she had to have made her way around town, learned its approximate borders. But surely that couldn't have taken a few hours of time, unless she'd also spent significant time learning the rules for crossing streets in specific places, watching the jing up of those behemoths called cars, and learning of the existence of celebrities, corporations, brands, production of cycles, video games, psychotherapy, ents, disposable forks, Swiss Army knives, schizophrenia, baseball caps, polyamory, robots, fudgesicles, something called Wikipedia, tan lines, other languages, other continents, 80s hairstyles, the Harlem Renaissance, jaywalking, arson, murder and jaywalking concept, not that exact name, Methodists. Her eyes snapped open, and she wished for a calendar to check to make sure she hadn't accidentally spent 27 hours instead of a measly 3 simply immersed in this world. Was this normal here, or was she in need of some of that psychotherapy? The sky above indicated that it was mid-afternoon, so she invested a not small amount of effort to pushing all this new information out of her head to make space for her thoughts. Priority 1. Find the other Akatsuki members. Or at least, the strangers that looked like them. Nothing in the past few hours contradicted her previous thoughts that she should look somewhere people usually get together, such as a bar, so she didn't have to do much thinking to decide what to do. The only problem was that she didn't exactly remember where a bar was. She'd seen one at some point, but she didn't remember its exact address. She thought it might have been near the car crash site, but couldn't be completely sure, and the vehicles had probably been moved by now. She sighed and stood up, deciding that she'd probably find it the same way she'd found it the first time. Not to mention, if any of that had been true, there might still be a residual connection leading her to him. Konan forgot to consider the possibility of finding anyone else first. She wandered pretty much aimlessly, looking for any indication that someone was going to or coming from the bar. 1 street north, then 2 streets east, then west 1, north 3, east 1, south 5, east 2, south 2 and west 1. She paused to consider how useless going in a circle probably was, when a sound caught her attention. It was a small sound, of someone moving quietly. That was precisely why it attracted her attention. She turned around in a hurry, only for something to move on the other side of her at the same time. Between her and the wall. It was also the sound of something moving quickly. The only reason she hadn't instinctively leapt onto the nearest roof was because her ears had somehow put together a picture of something small from the noises. Not that small couldn't mean dangerous. She spun around even faster, following the unknown being's path, and caught a glimpse of something black flowing around the corner at about mid-thigh height. Less than a blink, and it was gone. Anyone else would have wondered if they had imagined something, but that thought didn't even occur to the reasonably paranoid Kunoichi. She followed it to the next intersection and spun around the corner to face north in the space of 1 1/3 seconds. What she found there was nothing. No small animals or children with long black hair, nothing else that could have created that impression, nothing. Her eyes instantly traveled up the street to the next intersection, attempting to calculate exactly how fast it could have been moving. She'd traveled almost a complete street west to this intersection, had been only a few running steps away. Something running with excellent turning ability could have made it in the time it took her to finish a complete rotation. But there was nothing up the street either. Nothing, that is, except the exact bar she had remembered. Konan, not one to use coincidence as a first explanation, immediately wondered if this was accident or intention. She remembered the voice in the dark from last night. That voice had been within striking distance, but had not harmed her. It had called her interesting, and expressed approval of what she was doing and how she was going about it. It also blended into the dark so well she could not see a thing while looking directly at its source. If what she was doing was so entertaining, it wasn't a stretch to wonder if she'd just received a very creepy form of eye stance meant to nudge the action along. The streets were quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. Konan checked again anyway, then tentatively accepted this explanation and relaxed somewhat. She prepared herself and began to walk up the street to the bar. After a few steps she stopped. She'd overlooked something. She looked to her right at a metal garbage can sitting on the sidewalk with a lid on. It was wide enough for her to stand in, and waist high. She remembered a clinking sound as she turned the corner. She lightly tapped on the lid, and the sound it made didn't seem quite right, as if the vibrations were being absorbed by something. If it really was that voice, somehow it had known what she was thinking last night. It would not do to antagonize such a powerful potential ally. If it was not, then it would also not do to antagonize someone who just wanted to be helpful. She rested her fingers on the lid and said softly, "Thank you," then turned and continued on her way. She was wrong. As her form grew smaller and more distant, the lid of the garbage can clinked again as it tilted, and lifted up very slightly. A small pair of eyes watched her go. The voiceless one, with pale skin and long black hair, wondered with his golden eyes if she would be his friend. And he was disappointed that she hadn't looked. A ninja, a soldier and a criminal walked into a bar. Unlike the others, the ninja was not here to have herself a good time. Konan wrinkled her nose at the sense of alcoholic beverages she'd never tasted nor heard of. The smell of alcohol was fine. The smell of whatever else was in those drinks was not. Add to that the smell of someone violating the bar's "no smoking" sign, which was clearly posted, and she had to repress the urge to scratch her head as she wondered why a place like this would be so crowded and full of people seemingly enjoying themselves. The music wasn't even all that good, and if the food was, it shouldn't matter since she didn't see anyone eating. If such an atmosphere was good for anything, it was feeling alone and isolated in a crowd. She felt like that now, as the sounds faded into a background blur, a bubble keeping any one voice from reaching her. For such a public place, she was surprised to find it felt so secretive. Her eyes drifted over the crowd, looking for something distinctive and not finding it. The sights blurred into an indistinct background of people too, and she had to shake her head and take several deliberate steps away from the entrance before resuming her search. Only then did she realize as the pressure lifted that a stranger had been standing right against her arm the whole time. This was not a place for someone with sharply trained senses to be. She shuddered as the ceaseless sensory input overwhelmed her, and prayed that what she was looking for was here. Konan stopped looking around at all of this and allowed herself to be swept numbly into the bar as more people came in. The door. When she no longer felt uncomfortably close to another person, she looked up and realized this bar had a seating area with actual tables and chairs. Several of those tables were occupied, but one was occupied more interestingly than the others. She allowed a smile to reach her face, and strode confidently over. Hidan. What a headache. There are so many people, my brain feels full. If he would just stop shuffling and finish his drink, whoa. Hidan's eyes widened as he absorbed the strong-looking lady walking up to him. She was wearing the most kick cloak he'd ever seen. I've gotta get me one of those. She had blue hair. Like Shark Boy. Wonder if she knows him. Her eyes appeared to glow, and he felt a very, very determined and dangerous feeling wash over him. He promptly reached over and grabbed his friend's wrist, spilling cards on the table as Kakuzu had been right in the middle of a shuffle. But of course that wasn't even worth noticing in these circumstances. Before Kakuzu could get a sound out, Hidan whispered urgently, "Drop dead gorgeous lady approaching. Try not to be up this time," all without taking his eyes off her as she stopped at their table and comfortably pulled out a tea like she had every right in the world to be there with them. She sat down and looked right into his eyes. Hidan got a feeling of familiarity from her gaze, and he realized that the way she looked into his face so gladly was like she knew him. He didn't recall ever meeting her, but if a lady knows you, a lady knows you. She could be some sort of goddess or something, you never know. He could easily imagine her being some kind of goddess. Maybe a goddess of pain or battle or blood, something like that. The feeling around her, like she did have certain connections, did not discourage his thoughts on this matter. In the space of a second, he knew 3 things for sure. 1. She was here for a reason. 2. She wanted him for whatever she was doing. 3. He would absolutely do anything she asked. Her eyes moved from him to Kakuzu, who had stopped his grumbling as soon as Hidan spoke and was now watching her in a very, from Hidan's point of view, unfriendly way. Of course, it was just suspicion at an oddly dressed woman stopping at their table in a way that violated social convention. He didn't remember her either, she was a stranger. And yet this blue-haired lady had seen fit to claim a spot at their table like an old friend. Or maybe a girlfriend. Kakuzu's eyes traveled over to Hidan, both to avoid her oddly intense gaze and because Hidan was still holding his wrist. He seemed to have forgotten entirely and was completely still while watching her every move with glazed-over eyes and a smile like she was someone they knew. Kakuzu returned his attention to the stranger. The look in her eyes was not comfortable, but he trusted Hidan's reactions by now, and agreed that she did seem more relevant than your average bar floozy. His fingers fumbled as he pried Hidan's from around his wrist, and Kakuzu found himself hoping despite his size and strength that she would look back at his half-companion so he could take back his usual role of watching silently while Hidan handled the weirdos. Not that she seemed merely weird. The woman smiled out of the blue and looked down for a moment. Then she looked back at Hidan, who correctly interpreted her smile as amusement and realized how she must have looked to Kakuzu. Holy crap, I've never felt Kakuzu be intimidated like this. I forgot words. Why do I feel like I do know her somehow? There's something in her. No, around her, with her. No, that's not it. Something that I definitely know. He reflected her smile back, and there was a moment like they were sharing a private joke. Considering that Kakuzu had no idea what was happening and was glad not to, they were. She blinked deliberately, and Hidan almost hallucinated a thunk sound as whatever had just been happening ended and Busi. Ness mode began. She looked between the two of them very quickly and said, mostly to Hidan, I have a proposal for the two of you. Kakuzu narrowed his eyes, but Hidan's widened and he spoke almost involuntarily, what proposal? Quote. The woman smiled slightly, a polite smile to get a friendly atmosphere going, not a real one, Hidan noticed, and continued. My name is Konan. I have something I am trying to find out more about, and I need your help to do so. Actually, I need several other people's help in addition to yours. If you go to this location, she pulled out a piece of paper with something written on it, I believe I have found a suitable place to gather up everybody and tell you all what it is I want help with. She held out the piece of paper, and Hidan immediately memorized the address written there. Kakuzu decided to break from his usual role and said, I'll need more information before I trust your word on this. He'd seen the paper too, and recognized the address as being pretty far out of town and abandoned. After the effect her gaze had had on him earlier, he wasn't so sure that she would be unable to do anything to them, even if she was telling the truth about needing other people there as well. Konan didn't have any arguments against that. She looked at Hidan, and experienced a small twinge of relief at his glaring at Kakuzu. Kakuzu looked back, and Hidan just huffed and said, "I'll be there. Any time." Quote, "No, I'm not sure how long I'll need to gather everyone else." Although she hadn't offered any clarification beyond several others, Hidan thought of Shark Boy for the second time this encounter. "Well, if you go outside, turn left and walk 2 blocks, then turn left again, there's an aquarium W. Here a guy the first no should be getting off work soon. And if you don't turn left, but keep going for another block, there's a gas station with another guy the first no." Konan smiled slightly, but Hidan could feel her practically flowering. That was such good news. As usual, he reflected this feeling and was glad he'd told her, no matter how strongly Kakuzu glared at him. She tucked the piece of paper back into a pocket hidden under her cloak somewhere and got up to leave. When she stood and looked down at him, Hidan felt a sudden itching of his fingertips, a desire to touch. He wondered what that might be since she was totally covered up and all, and then realized the feeling was coming from her. He became aware that he was not covered up in the slightest above the waist, and quite glad for that. The unknown thing he'd felt earlier between them didn't disappear as she walked away, it just felt like it stretched somehow. He knew her, somehow. And he would make Kakuzu drive him to that address if he had to rip off his own arm and use it as a spear to do it. Speaking of which, he turned to glare at Kakuzu, who was staring at him with an expression that said wow. Just wow. Kakuzu raised an eyebrow upon seeing the look on his face and sighed. "We're going to meet up with your new girlfriend no matter what I say, aren't we?" "Yes, we are going exactly there, and you will listen closely as to whatever she has to say. I'm glad you've finally learned some sense." Hidan sighed happily and sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He then opened his eyes and got a confused look on his face for a few seconds before turning and asking, "Wait. Did you say girlfriend?" Kakuzu decided he probably wouldn't get as good an opportunity for some teasing ever again. "Yes, I said girlfriend. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it's about time you settled down and stopped living like a caveman in the woods. You're about at the age for settling down, maybe marriage, perhaps even kids." Hidan looked like he was going to explode with some combination of emberment and anger and end this line of thinking, so Kakuzu quickly added, "And you should work on not looking so lovestruck in public. After swooning that visibly, she definitely thinks you're an easy mark for any favors she wants. I wish I had thought to pull out my phone and take a picture, it was so artistic. You could be in a museum exhibition of human emotions." Quote, Hidan held himself back just in time from breaking the bottle Kakuzu was allegedly not done drinking from and threatening him with it. Instead, he reached over and slapped Kakuzu's hand like it was a misbehaving puppy. "Shish, shut up, you moron. I wasn't lovestruck. She just felt really powerful and like I knew her, and I'm pretty sure there was or should be something between us that I don't know what it is. Off." Kakuzu decided to let him dig his hole deeper. "I don't want any of that shit with her. She just looked kind of amazing and sweet, and I'm really sure that whatever she has to say will be awesome. Yeah, maybe a decent lay too if she wants to go for that. But that's not what she was here for, and you know it." Hidan stumbled upon a strategy that might be much more effective, and changed tactics. "Besides, I'm pretty sure I felt you cowering and shit when she was looking at you. You know exactly what I mean when I talk about that look in her eyes. It was like she could have taken care of you in a heartbeat, and you know it, you coward. Don't go accusing me of anything when you think she must be pretty awesome too." Quote, Kakuzu was pretty sure that any moment now people were going to start looking, and he was ashamed to admit he had felt a shrinking fear-like sensation under her gaze. "I'm no coward, and I will sell you to the zoo if you say that ever again. But fine, if you want to deny it, go ahead. Just don't come running to me if you want a wingman to help you ask her out." Hidan didn't break the bottle, but he did sweep it off the table where it smashed to the ground, made a hazardous mess, and attracted the opposite amount of attention from what Kakuzu had been aiming for. "Did you just say I'd need help?" Kakuzu fumbled again as he hurriedly picked up his cards and tried to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. Shut up, you brain-dead idiot. He cursed himself under his breath at the same time for using the H word. That had never once, ever, been a good idea. That word was only good for provoking Hidan into something stupider than usual. What was he thinking? Yell at me outside if you want, just please stop now. Hidan clenched his fists and stormed out theatrically, headed for the car. Kakuzu left money on the table to cover their drinks and the cleanup and left soon after. As he pulled his coat over his tank top and thanked God he normally wore a mask to hide his stitches, he was forced to ask for the nth time just today why he put up with Hidan's ridiculous childishness. At that moment, all of Hidan's many competencies just didn't seem like enough. When Konan thought of the way her life had always been, it seemed distant. The road of the ninja was a twisting one, full of suffering and pain. It required no small determination to go down, and unthinkable personal strength to overcome its many obstacles, just like climbing over a mountain. She looked at this new road. Rock hard, set in stone, unwavering. Control was in higher demand here than fortitude, and creativity in place of strength. She looked after the metal carriage again. What this road promised was unending power, but slippery power too. She felt something shift inside, and saw in her mind the metal carriage sliding on its wheels, lurching into the air and slamming down again, perhaps turning over. She grasped her stomach, gasping. Do I have that control? I'd better. This isn't a dirt path anymore. She stepped onto the road again, noting that it seemed right this time, and continued east with her ears on alert for other travelers. After a few more kilometers, the road branched. Konan was standing on one of the branches, and the other took almost a 90-degree turn to her left. So, turn north to see what was up there, or continue east to enter town. Step 1. Find a place to get them together outside of town. Step 2. Find them, most likely in town. Follow the priorities. She turned left. After some time, buildings appeared on either side of her as she ran. They were houses. They certainly were larger and better maintained than the shacks she'd spent the night in, but they seemed too well maintained. She didn't see anybody, but a child's toy lay near the side of the road with not a scratch on it, nor a hint of rust. She darted her eyes around. Curtains in all the windows. Good. She darted between two houses on her right, smiled at the providence that had not placed anyone in their backyards at this precise moment, and entered the edges of the forest again. If this was the worst inconvenience she found in this world, she'd be very lucky. As she continued running, she wondered why it seemed that nobody was there. Even in the rain village, where people didn't spend a lot of time outside because of the weather, there was always someone returning home, leaving home, etc. And why did it seem as if nobody was home? She didn't see any mothers or children. Was there some abandonment of homes going on? But they still looked as if people lived there. The way people lived seemed to make little sense. Konan filed that under her rapidly growing, mysteries to be solved later, folder, right next to the lack of shops or other public spaces within reasonable distance of where people lived. She also wondered about the features of their homes. Most of them had large white doors in front. Or, at least, doors were the only things it made sense for them to be. The other differences, such as lack of usable porches, she attributed to general difference in culture between worlds. But the huge doors, she could not figure out. That would have to wait until she reached the end of the neighborhood, where she heard yelling coming from inside a house that was not as well taken care of as the others. It seemed to be a woman yelling. A man replied angrily, and the front door made a slamming noise as he threw it back against the house while he left. Konan had crept closer to the corner of the house she was now peering around, and she watched silently with her eyes narrowed as the man used a side door to enter the space behind the large white door. It had no visible rust, but the straining sound as it opened suggested this part of the house received no better treatment than the overgrown lawn. Her heartbeat quickened as it struggled upward, and her mouth opened slightly as two round black shapes first became visible, and then the rest came into view. People keep those monsters inside. How could they keep that beauty hidden in the dark? As the man got inside, turned it on, a mechanical carriage and propelled it out onto the paved path leading from the house. She got her first good look at a powerful metal steed that wasn't moving too fast to clearly see. Whoa! The bottom of it was already a victim of rust that seemed to be creeping upward from somewhere below, and its wheels flattened slightly under its own weight, but that in no way detracted from its design, which gave her the same eerie feeling of speed and slipperiness as seeing the first one racing along had done. Those curves. Wait, flattened! Exclamation mark. Her astonishment grew as she noticed that yes, the wheels were changing shape as the man got out and reached for his bags. The average civilian here rides inside a metal, mechanical rhinoceros supported by air. Question mark. She forced herself to edge back behind the corner, slow her breathing, and pay attention to her inner thoughts. Her inner thoughts were loud enough she failed to notice the beginnings of discomfort in her eyes caused by excessive dilation. Want. Want. Explode. Want. Something else grew as, even while she was trying to reason that she wasn't ready for that speed yet, she heard the man let out a sharp cry of pain and begin cursing. In less than 1/2 of a second she looked again and saw that he'd accidentally hit his hand on the rusty corn. Of its hatch, or would that also be called a door? This world's definition of door is too damn big, and cut himself. She'd only heard one other man capable of such rapid-fire, repetitive cursing in her life, and the thought of him did nothing whatsoever to shrink her pupils down to normal or stop the low purr that started in her throat. After he grabbed some tissues out of his vehicle and wiped his hand on them, he threw the bags in and eased it down the path and onto the road. She disappeared around the house as he faded into the distance, but resumed purring a second later. Actually, this round was inspired by the thought of her hand running down longish white hair, like she'd run her hands along a cat's, and the deeper purring, low growling that might elicit. But on to other business. Konan pressed her thumbnail into her palm, blinked hard, and returned to the corner of the house. There were no more houses beyond his, the road seemed to fork at that point. She promised to get herself one of those machines as soon as possible, reason be damned, and went to check out the fork. One side curved back east, toward the town. The other went away from town, in the opposite direction. There were no priorities to follow this time, as neither path clearly indicated that it led into town. But, she recalled that one of the characteristics of her ideal place was that it should be abandoned, and she saw that the yellow lines on the road leading away from town were patchy, cracked, and the road itself had holes in it. Not gigantic holes, clearly it had been maintained sometime within reason, but certainly not as often as it needed. Abandoned, but not too abandoned. She promised not to waste any of this gift of good fortune and quickly set off down the yellow patched road. Despite her earlier anxiety, fortune was swinging her way. Not for the first time, Konan wondered what, exactly, her inner will was and why Hidan was always telling her about Jashin-sama as if he was extremely relevant to her life. He can give me a necklace himself if he wants. I'm just going to see where this new road leads. Onward. The sun warmed her hair and dappled the flower in it as she ran. As she walked out of the bar, a noticeable wave of lightheadedness hit. She moved aside and stopped for a few seconds to marvel at the fresh air and presence of light. Now that she thought about it, the bar had actually been surprisingly dark when you looked past the plenitude of things to look at. She had been in bars before, but only on spying missions because such places happened to be useful for gathering information. She had never actually tasted alcohol, and the bars in question had been in her world. If he hadn't been there, this lack of experience might have seriously injured her efforts. But he had been there, shirtless and with his hair combed back, looking just like he usually did. Well, almost. She had expected Hidan to trust her to some degree after merely looking, and she had expected him to persuade others to trust her by whatever method he may choose. But the way he acted hadn't been at all what she expected. What she expected was that he wouldn't remember her, would treat her as a stranger. Instead, he'd been taken aback by her presence, as if he hadn't remembered her until she showed up, at which time he was overcome by a blast from the past. That was the only reason she could think of why he'd looked so overwhelmed by her presence. One normally didn't have to think much about a stranger, that's what snap judgments based on only a few characteristics are for. Strangers don't warrant intense mental energy, not at first glance. Yet intense focus and thought was what she'd gotten, and Konan could not think of any reason why that might be. The only way this general rule of human interaction could be defied was if the stranger had some characteristic that was particularly interesting, which she did not seem to. They weren't strangers, but he wasn't supposed to remember her, or if more information was available than just a few characteristics. She knew well the surprisingly high quality of Hidan's eyes, so it was possible that upon first meeting he could have learned much more about who she was and other things simply by looking. She didn't think he could have seen enough to be so overwhelmed by, though. Had something changed for him? Her senses restored, Konan turned left and proceeded to follow Hidan's instructions. The buildings did seem to be grouped in rough rectangular shapes, so she guessed that blocks meant intersections. After reaching the second intersection, she stopped. He had said that if she turned left, there would be an aquarium, but if she did not, there would be someone else at a gas station. Who to visit first? She decided that it would be easier to explore the dead ends first. If she went to the aquarium, the only person she could see working with marine life was Kisame, who wasn't very sociable and open to forming connections. He was the least likely to know anyone else she needed. Whoever it was at the gas station, they had to be more outgoing and or open than Kisame, because it was very difficult to be less so unless one was a full-time hermit or agoraphobe. Aquarium first, then. She turned left. Kisame. Sigh, I love my job. This was what the shark man thought as he carefully placed dead fish into the shark bucket, carefully checking to see if any of them were diseased as he did so. The smell of fish might not be good for one's social life, but Itachi didn't mind and neither did any others he was casual acquaintances with, and that was all the social life he desired. Kisame was very glad to be back at his job after a couple months of vacation, and to see Itachi again. Just as importantly, he was glad to see Samahata again. Well, that's fitting. A shark among sharks. Not that that's really the case. He tugged his work hoodie tighter over the gills on his shoulders, then picked up the bucket and began the walk to the shark tank. No, stop it, Kisame. You know damn well that is really the case. You are a shark. Own it like you always have. What's up with this sudden insecurity? The uncomfortable truth was, he didn't really know. It had just happened very recently, within days, that he'd started really noticing what he was and how weird it was. It was irrational, of course. He'd always been very sharky in appearance, and there was no reason why that fact should be different now. It just seemed kind of weird that he hadn't really noticed that other people weren't sharky until that same time. But who cares about that? Insecurity was for people who weren't strong enough to resist social conditioning about their bodies. He was no weakling like that. But still, nobody else has looked at me funny, it's just my own personal discomfort. For my own comfort, maybe I should find out why I have scales and gills, etc. Facts are facts, and the facts are that's abnormal. Okay, that was a way of stating it that was acceptable. Not general insecurity about appearance, just curiosity about a phenomenon he'd seen. That was cool. Also cool were the waters of the shark tank. Kisame looked up at it, observed how easily its occupants swam, and scanned the bottom. His favorite of its fishy residents usually rested on the bottom, which he fully recognized was not something that sharks were able to do. Well, some species were, and he didn't really know what species Samahata was, but even they did it only by pumping water over their gills. He'd gotten the chance to look at Samahata resting like that for an extended time once, and it appeared to be perfectly natural and easy, not taking energy at all. It occurred to Kisame that perhaps his realization some days ago when he'd come back from vacation had a silver lining to it. Now we both get to be freaks of the shark tank. I like spending time with him even better now that we have more in common. Samahata had never been, but it was easier to think of a best friend as the same gender he was. Today, Kisame got no such opportunity for extended observation. By the time he spotted his dark-scaled pal half hidden under a rock, Samahata had spotted him and almost immediately rushed to the top of the tank where the feeding platform was. Kisame grinned and climbed up the ladder as fast as was recommended. When he got there, Samahata had managed to throw himself halfway out of the water, and lay there slapping the ground with his small pectoral fins. He couldn't raise his head without risking slipping back into the water, so he made a rattling growling sound and wagged his body slightly as Kisame approached. This latest incident was one of many that had previously meant little to Kisame except as proof of how special his favorite was, but which, ever since his revelation, had inspired fear. He looked around quickly and saw no one except a janitor starting her rounds of this floor on the other side of the large room. Even so, he crouched down and allowed Samahata to bite his hand in the usual playful manner, only warily, and with his senses street ill fully open in case a supervisor or somebody else with authority walked in. As he slipped off his thick gloves, which was a safety violation he'd have been fired for if any inspectors had been investigating at that moment, he wondered why his life seemed to have shifted into such a bizarro diamonds ion when absolutely nothing in it had changed. His fingers free, Kisame was a